Hi and welcome to today's session. Today's session is all about scope. So today we will check out what do we mean if we say scope or talk about scope in Java at least today. So you all know that we can declare a variable in specifying a data type. For example, let's create a integer variable, a number, and let's access the number, a value. And you know that here inside this method now, there we got an integer variable called number, in this case with the value 5, and later on maybe let's declare a second variable, number 2 equals 5, and then maybe a third, or just let's print number, so number plus number 2, for example. And let's run this, and you see that here, if you do it like that, yeah, just has to compile. And but you see that here, for example, IntelliJ doesn't say that there are any errors or something like that. So we can use number and number 2. Here IntelliJ also highlights the variable number 2, and here IntelliJ highlights the variable number, and if the program runs, then we get our expected result. 5 plus 5 is 10. So inside this method here, you see that we can declare a variable number and also other variables, and then inside this method we also can use those variables. So let's create another method, public static int add, for example. And yeah, let's maybe take those two numbers, and let's just calculate number, or let's rename this a little bit. It looks a little bit better for number 1. Number 1 and number 2, and here this result add should just return this here, number 1 plus number 2. So let's do this, return number 1 plus number 2, like that. And here we just want to call add now, and you see IntelliJ also says or highlights something, that those two things here in red, those two variables in red, and IntelliJ also says that the symbol number 1 and the symbol number 2 cannot be resolved. And why? Because this number 1 and this number 2 is only available inside this main method, inside this block here, inside this main method code block. And that is called the scope. So if we talk about the scope, there is, for example, a method scope that specific variables, for example number 1 and number 2, if you declare them inside this method, of course you only can use them inside this method. The same is also for arguments or for parameters. Since args here is an argument or parameter of the main method, you can use args inside. You see, IntelliJ also completes this. You can use args only inside the main method, since it is a parameter from the main method. And in the add method, for example, there IntelliJ does not highlight it, and it also does not exist, cannot resolve symbol args. And here, if you type args here, you see that this is the string array, our argument, our parameter of our main entry point, our main method. So that's the scope. So the scope, for example, let's talk about, or let's use the word in some sentences. So the scope of the args parameter or argument is the main method. The scope of this argument starts here when the method, the angle brackets here of the method open, or curly brackets, of course. Here in the beginning curly brackets, and the scope ends at the ending curly brackets of the method. The same is for number 1 and number 2 variable here. Since we declared those two variables inside our main method, the scope starts at the curly bracket, at the opening curly bracket of the method, and the scope ends at the closing curly bracket. What can we do? Of course, we can pass those two numbers as an argument to the add method. So here we can define two arguments, int number 1 and int number 2. And now here they are not read anymore. Number 1 is this argument here, the first argument, number 2 the second argument. And here we can also pass those two arguments inside here. And if we run it, then once it compiles everything and it runs the program, we should get the same output like before, so 10. Of course, so now those two numbers still have the scope of the main method. The scope begins here and ends here. We only pass those two numbers, or those two variables, or the values of those two variables to the add method. We only pass the values to the add method, and those arguments here are not the same variables, so we didn't extend the scope of the variable, for example, but we created two arguments that have, if we run this here, the same value as those variables. So now here in the main method we got two variables, number 1, number 2, with the scope of the main method, and here now we got two arguments, or two parameters, and the scope of those two parameters, of course, is the add method. So the scope begins here and ends here. Of course, you don't have to use number 1, number 2. You can just rename it for n1 and n2, for example. So maybe to make a little bit more different. So you see that those two are still those variables here inside the main method, and this here are just the parameters or arguments of the add method. And those two arguments have the scope of the add method, and those two variables here have the scope of the main method. Of course, you can also create another variable, like let's create in this case, because the main method is static, we will create also static variable. Let's create a private static string message, for example. Let's assign a value hi, and you see that this message, for example, we can use this message inside our main method. You see that it highlights it already, the IntelliJ already highlights the variable here. So we can use the variable or the static field, for example. If you declare a variable at a class level like that, you can say that's a static field. So it's here you can access the static field, of course, inside. Let's shrink that a little bit, inside the main method. And of course you can also use the field inside the add method. Why can we use the static field here inside the main method and also inside the add method? Of course, because we declared it on the class level. So maybe let's call it class level scope. I don't know if those wordings are, or if there is some thing like that, official wording for those things. Let's in this case call it for that. I just want to explain a little bit what scope is here. So the class level scope, for example, if you declare a field here, then the scope begins with the curly bracket, with the beginning curly bracket of the class, and ends with the ending curly bracket of the class. So the scope of this static field here begins here and ends here. And you see, maybe you see a pattern here. So you declared this field here, and the parent or the block, let's say the code block, let's say a opening curly bracket and a closing curly bracket define a code block. So if you declare a variable inside a code block, then that's this. For this example here, let's say that's the scope of this variable here. So of course the scope, or it also has to do something with the access modifiers, if it's private or public. If it's private, of course you can just use it inside the class. If you make it public, you can also use it outside of the class and do something like main dot message. But to explain the scope of a variable, so you declared the message here, and the opening curly bracket, or the scope goes from the opening curly bracket in the code block where you defined it to the closing curly bracket. And here you got a variable number, or two variables, number 1, number 2, and also an argument, and there is the scope from the opening curly bracket of the method to the closing curly bracket of the method. Of course, there are also other things in Java that have those opening and closing curly brackets. Of course, can be an if, for example, if number 1 equals number 2, then if we declare some other number inside this if code block here, then this some other number is also only available inside this if code block here, inside this if block. So the scope of the some other number variable inside this if block begins here at the opening curly bracket of the if and ends at the closing curly bracket of the if. You can't exit it outside. You can't access it outside of the if because the scope is only inside this code block here. Of course, you also can't access it inside the else block of the if, because the scope of this variable starts here and ends here. And here in the else if, we start a new code block, and there is also a new scope starts. Of course, what is possible inside here is that you can, there's no problem by using variables of a higher scope. For example, number 1 and number 2 are declared outside or inside the method, but outside of this if block scope, and the if statement here is inside the method. So we can use number 1 and number 2. You can also showcase it or visualize it like that. If you declare a variable somewhere here inside those two curly brackets, then you can see that here the scope starts and here it ends For the other numbers, so only insert this into these highlighted lines, the some other number variable is available. So that's the scope for the some other number variable. For number 2 and number 1 and number 2, can do the same thing. Here it starts and here it ends. So inside these highlighted lines, number 1, number 2 is available everywhere. Also inside the if and inside the else statement, of course. And you can do the same thing with the message. So here the scope starts and here it ends. Or to be more specific, here it starts inside those brackets, of course, and here it ends, not outside. So here it starts the scope and here it ends, and you can use message everywhere inside here, in our methods, in our if blocks, and so on. Of course, the same is also for a switch statement. If you have switch number 1, for example, then maybe you have a case 1 and case 2. Then you see that if you declare a variable, again, some other number equals 4, then this some other number, the scope of this some other number starts here and ends here. And since the scope of some other number, the variable some other number here, the scope of the some other number variable here is from the beginning of the if curly bracket until the closing curly bracket of the if, and the again some other number here is from the beginning of the switch opening bracket and the closing bracket. We of course can also, since some other number isn't available inside it, here IntelliJ just suggests the again some other number variable, but not the some other number variable. So in this case, if they have totally different scope, we can also just declare a variable with the same name here, because, like I said, they have a totally different scope. The some other number variable got a scope from here to here, and the if statement isn't inside the scope, and the some other number variable inside the if statement has the scope from here to here, and the switch statement isn't inside the scope. The only thing that that is not what you can't do is to declare some other variable in a some other number variable here at the method level. I mean, you can declare it, of course, at the method level, but you see that there's some other number variable now at the method level here got the scope from here to here, and the scope of the if statement and of the switch statement is also inside the scope. And you see, IntelliJ also already marks those two things as there's something not there are some issues. And if you over the variable here, it says IntelliJ says that the variable some other number is already defined in the scope, because again, scope of this variable here from here to here, and there is the if and the switch scope included. So you can't do something like that to declare since you also can't declare two variables with the same name here. You also can't declare two variables with the same name inside the same scope. So you can't declare two variables or more variables, multiple variables with the same name inside the same scope. But if you remove this, you see that here the scope is from here to here, and the scope of this variable is from here to here, so they have a different scope, so that's totally fine. The same applies also if you make a private static field, some other number, for example, like that, then you see that this will work because because this is defined in the this is a field, and this is declared at the class level. The only issue you will get is here inside the scope here, if you have a local variable, some other number, and also a field, some other number, and if you want to use it, now you have to make sure that you use the correct variable. So if you use it like that, then the local variable will be used. But if you want to use this variable here, some other number, you have to do something like, I think that this won't work because it's a static field. So I think you have to put the class's name in front and tell here to use the some other number field of the main class. So now the field gets used, will be used here to inside the system out print line instead of the local variable. If you skip the class here, of course you see that now the local variable will be used and not the field anymore. So you can do those things. You can declare a field with the same name as a local variable, but if you use it, you have to make sure that you use the correct variable, either the local one or the field. If you want to use the local one, that's fine. If you want to use the field, make sure that you put the class name in front of it. Of course, if this isn't a, let's say we don't have a static context, we have just a public void, normal non-static method that does something, and here we also have int some other number, and here now we also want to output or want to use some other number. You see that here the local variable again gets used, but let's say we have just a field. We don't have a static field anymore, and here we are also not in a static context. And here now if you do this, you see that it won't recognize the field because it's not static anymore. So if it is not static anymore, then if you want to address the field of the class, the non-static field, if you want to address the non-static field of the class instead of the local variable, then you have to use the this keyword. So now if you use the this keyword, this refers to the current class, and you can read it like that. I use some other number of this class, the some other number variable or field or property or attribute of this class here, and not the local one. So that's the difference between static and non-static. Good. Yeah. What else? Yeah, of course, if you do something like this, if you create a switch statement here, we already said that here our int some other number, the scope of some other number variable is inside this block here. So if you have a second case, of course you can't declare some other number variable because a variable with the same name already exists inside this scope. What you can do is to create a code block out of this case. So we can say case 1 then open a code block and close a code block. And now you see that this here, we created a scope here, we open the scope here, close the scope here, and now we can do whatever we want or declare whatever variable we want inside here. And can also declare a variable with the same name inside our case 2 statement, since the some other number variable of the case 1 statement, the scope of this variable is now from here to here, and the scope of the some other number variable from case 2 statement is from here to here. Of course, if we have a case, let's skip this, case 3 again, then there we again will have some issues if we created some other variable, a variable with the same name of another, which was already or is already declared inside another case statement. So here we get some issues because they got the same scope, and again we can create here another scope. We can also create for each. We can also create for each case statement a scope here. So here we don't have, now with that we won't get any conflicts with variables that have the same name, for example. Since you saw how to declare or create a scope, we can also just use the curly brackets in just like that. There is no if, no switch, no nothing, just 2 curly brackets. And here let's do it like that. So now we created this a code block here, we open the code block here, we close the code block here, and the I variable now, the scope of the I variable now is from here to here. So now we can also create a second code block like that, create a new I variable with the value 4, and we won't have any issues with something that there are 2 variables of the same name, because the scope of this variable, or let's say this variable exists only inside this block here, and this variable only exists inside this block. So you can't use the I variable outside of this block, of course, because it doesn't exist outside. It only exists inside either this block and also inside this block, and those 2 variables are also not the same, and they don't have anything in common, except that here, if you look at it, they got the same data type and the same name, but a totally different scope. So the scope is really the area, maybe let's say the area, or maybe let's say the code block where you can use the variable and where this variable exists. If you have 2 variables with the same name and the same scope, of course, that's not possible. And yeah, maybe a small recap, that you have methods. Let's say that's the method scope. You can declare variables inside the method, or you can also have arguments, and they exist only inside the method. You can use them for whatever reason only inside this method. Then there are also other statements like if, switch, or just some code blocks like that. And those variables you can only use inside the code block or the scope you defined them. So there's some other number variable, since you defined it inside the if code block, the scope is from the beginning curly bracket to the ending curly bracket of this if statement, so of this if code block, since we declared the variable inside this code block. It only exists inside this code block. The same is for the switch statement, and here you have to be sure that you know what you do. If you skip those blocks, if you switch those blocks, of course, you see that now the some other number variable is the scope of the some other number variable is from the beginning of the switch to the end of the switch, and because of this we can't declare any other variable with the same name. Also, if it's here's the same like with the method. I mean, you have an if statement as some other number variable inside this if statement, so that is fine. But if you declare a variable at the method level 1 above, since the scope from some other variable here is from here to here, you can't declare another variable with the same name inside the scope. And here it is the same, since this the scope is from this variable is from here to here, you can't declare another variable with the same scope. To avoid this, we gave each case statement its own scope, like that. Yeah. Here's the same. Here we have two arguments, and 1 and 2, and the scope of those two arguments, of course, is from here to here. And then we also used fields, in this case a static field, and the field or the class level scope is, of course, throughout the whole class, and it begins from the opening curly bracket of the class and ends at the ending curly bracket of the class. So maybe a small or simple explanation would be that the scope is really the area or the code block where if you declare a variable inside the scope, then it only exists inside this scope. So thanks for today's session, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.